Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our event on China after Trump with our special guests Sheena Greitens, Minxin, and Jonathan Stromseth. Our program this evening is the second of a spring term series of programs at St. Olaf College on the topic of America after Trump. My name is Edmund Santuri. I'm a professor at St. Olaf College and Morrison Family Director of the college's Institute for Freedom and Community, the institute sponsoring tonight's event and the spring series just mentioned. The purpose of St. Olaf's Institute for Freedom and Community is to stimulate and support free inquiry and meaningful debate of important political and social issues among students, faculty, staff, and the larger public. By exploring diverse ideas about politics, markets, and society, the Institute aims to challenge presuppositions, question easier, comfortable answers, and foster constructive civil dialogue among those with differing values and contending points of view. For help in organizing our event tonight, as always, very special thanks go to Institute staff, Assistant Director Eric Grell, Administrative Assistant Linda Carlson, and Student Assistant Jess Horst. Thanks also to Jeff O'Donnell, Joshua Wyatt, and the St. Olaf Broadcast Media Services crew, and to Andrea Galswick, Dan Hollering, and Carrie Vanderveen of St. Olaf Marketing and Communications. Thanks finally to St. Olaf College faculty and students who have integrated their study with our program this evening, particularly participants in the Public Affairs Conversation supported by the Institute, the International Economics course, the Asian Conversations program, and other Asian Studies courses at the college. To remind our virtual audience members, you are invited to submit a question at any point during the discussion this evening by using the Participate tab on the streaming page. We are honored to have with us as our guests tonight Sheena Greitens, Minxin, and Jonathan Stromseth. Sheena Greitens is an associate professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin, where she's affiliated with both UT's Strauss Center and Clements Center for National Security. Her work focuses on authoritarian politics, East Asia, and American national security. Her written work on China and North Korea has appeared in prominent academic journals and edited volumes in English, Chinese, and Korean, and in major media outlets. Her book, Dictators and Their Secret Police, Coercive Institutions and State Violence, received the 2017 Best Book Award from both the International Studies Association and the Comparative Democratization section of the American Political Science Association. She holds a doctorate from Harvard University, an MPhil from Oxford University, where she studied as a Marshall Scholar, and a bachelor's from Stanford University. Minxin is the Tom and Margot Pritzker 72 Professor of Government at Claremont McKenna College and is an expert on governance in the People's Republic of China, U.S.-Asia relations, and democratization in developing nations. He's the author of 3 books. First, From Reform to Revolution, The Demise of Communism in China and the Soviet Union, China's Trapped Transition, The Limits of Developmental Autocracy, and China's Crony Capitalism, The Dynamics of Regime Decay, all published by Harvard University Press. Pei has also been a contributor to a number of important scholarly and popular journals and is a frequent guest commentator on CNN, National Public Radio, and other news outlets. He earned his bachelor's degree in English from the Shanghai International Studies University, master's degree and PhD in political science from Harvard University, and an MFA in creative writing from the University of Pittsburgh. Jonathan Stromseth has broad experience as a policymaker, scholar, and development practitioner. He is currently a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, where he holds the Lee Kuan Yew Chair in Southeast Asia Studies in the Center for East Asia Policy Studies. He also has a joint appointment with the Brookings John L. Thornton China Center. Stromseth is editor of the book Rivalry and Response, Assessing Great Power Dynamics in Southeast Asia, published in 2021, and co-author of the book China's Governance Puzzle, Enabling Transparency and Participation in a Single-Party State, published in 2017. Stromseth is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He holds a BA from St. Olaf College, so one of our own, and a doctorate in political science from Columbia University. There is much more that we could say about our distinguished guests. Our webpage for this event contains further information, but for now, Sheena Greitens, Minxin, and Jonathan Stromseth, welcome. We're so pleased to have you with us. One sometimes hears these days from certain China experts, people like Elizabeth Economy of the Council on Foreign Relations or Evan Osnos, who writes on China for the New Yorker magazine. One sometimes hears from such China experts something like the following general analysis of U.S.-China relations. Since 1979, when President Jimmy Carter normalized U.S. relations with China, and up until the time Donald Trump became president, U.S. policy toward China had been based on the idea, or at least the hope, more or less, that after a long period of China's international isolation under Mao Zedong, the more the U.S. engaged China as a respected player in the global political and economic game, the more cooperative and fair-playing China would turn out to be. The more open internally China would become, the more liberal economically it would become. And all of this would serve American interests, Chinese interests, and international interests in the long run. Well, so this analysis goes. Things haven't quite turned out this way. Under current preeminent leader Xi Jinping, according to this view, China has taken an authoritarian turn domestically, and its international behavior has become troublingly ambitious, expansionist, aggressive. At the very least, Chinese international comportment in this account hasn't measured up to what some take as reasonable standards of fair play, equity, and reciprocity with respect to things like information and technology sharing, access to markets, trade agreements, and the like. Again, this is a familiar analysis these days, however controversial an assessment it might be. In 2017, Donald Trump became president, offered his own critique of China's behavior and what he deemed as U.S. complacency in the face of that behavior, zeroed in particularly on what he saw as unfair trade imbalances between the U.S. and China, imposed tariffs on Chinese imports to rectify the trade imbalances, and generally adopted a more confrontational approach to China than what we had seen in recent presidential administrations prior to his own. Critics of Trump said the tariffs hurt the American economy, instigated a trade war, and heightened hostilities between the two nations. All of this was made more intense by COVID-19 and China's handling of the pandemic, which Trump criticized relentlessly. In addition, Trump's America First policy prompted a revisiting of American alliances with other nations bearing on relations with China. For example, Trump pulled the U.S. out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership because he judged it wasn't a good deal for the U.S., but critics thought that was a mistake since the partnership could have been exploited to exert leverage on China in various ways. More generally, critics argued Trump's foreign policy was too transactional, narrow, myopic, treating foreign relations on the model of isolated business deals without a larger, sustained, forward-looking strategy for advancing U.S. interests. In addition, according to his critics, Trump's China policy didn't pay enough attention to human rights, which allegedly were sacrificed too often as part of the Trumpian art of the deal in international negotiations. Now Joe Biden is president, and one might think this ought to signal a new state of affairs, but it's early yet. The signs are mixed and complex, and the trajectories are uncertain. Just last week, President Biden's Commerce Secretary, Gina Raimondo, said that the Trump tariffs on Chinese goods, quote, helped save American jobs. She said that there is a place for tariffs. And Biden himself has said the tariffs wouldn't be removed right away. But for President Biden, tariffs are just one part of a larger strategy in what he characterized recently as, and I quote, a battle between the utility of democracies in the 21st century and autocracies. End of quotation. A battle that calls for, among other things, investment in technologies to compete with China's own ambitious investments, the development of critical supply lines that do not depend on China, and an insistence on adherence to universal human rights in China's dealings with Hong Kong, the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, and others. We've got to prove democracies work, Biden proclaimed in his first presidential press conference. This is the way President Biden is thinking about, or at least talking about, U.S.-China policy after Trump. But now to our experts. How should President Biden be thinking about China after Trump? How should any of us be thinking about China after Trump? First, Sheena Greitens.
Thank Thank you very much. And let me just say, it's really a pleasure to be with all of you tonight, and I look forward to the conversation. I think that as we think about the Biden administration, it's important to think also about the history of where China has come from in the last really 5 to 10 years. And under Xi Jinping, I'd agree with your characterization from a few moments ago. That China has taken a more authoritarian turn and also a more personalist turn, in the power is increasingly concentrated in the person of Xi Jinping himself. But that affects a lot of different facets of China's behavior. And overall, China has turned to be increasingly repressive at home and assertive, even combative abroad. And so, in the past 5 to 10 years, what we've seen is that China has intensified repression in Xinjiang, tightened control in Hong Kong. It has engaged in an armed clash on its border with India. It has engaged in island reclamation and increasingly more assertive behavior in the South China Sea, something I think we'll talk more about later in the evening. And it has increased economic and military pressure on Taiwan, with some of the recent flights and air packages being sent along the midline Taiwan airspace being sort of the most recent development, and some of that occurring even this weekend and earlier this week. And that extends to actions taken against the United States and Europe as well, where in the course of a week, we saw the Chinese party state apply sanctions and threaten lawsuits against reporters, academics, research institutes, and political actors in Europe, the UK, Canada, and the United States in very swift succession, which sort of catalyzed a transatlantic conversation about how to handle some of the pressure that China is placing on academic freedom, not now only within its own borders, where there have always been significant academic restrictions, but also on the international scholarly community. So I think it's really important to start from there and to remember, when we think about the Biden administration strategy, we're thinking about a strategy that has been developed in the face of a real evolution in Chinese behavior. My own view is that some of that goes back to Xi Jinping's conception of what he calls either national or state security, and this concept of comprehensive national security that he premiered in 2014 and 2015. Prior to that, China had actually never written down an official national security document, but in 2015, for the first time, the Politburo approved a national security strategy. Now, it's not public. We don't know exactly what it is. We have official media reports about it, but it seems really focused on assuring party primacy. It is the core of the national security concept is political security, which is the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party with Xi Jinping at the core. And it seems to really be concerned about external developments insofar as they have the potential to threaten party control at home. And so, that has produced this whole set of behavior that I just described, increasingly repressive at home and assertive, even combative abroad. And much of that behavior, that began at the end or the second half of the Obama administration when Biden was vice president, but a lot of it really accelerated in the time that of the Trump administration. So, for example, the escalation in mass detention and collective forced re-education in Xinjiang really took a sharp uptick in the spring of 2017. So, I think that's a really important backdrop to understand what it is that's driving the Biden, national security strategy. We don't have a full national security strategy from them yet to outline how they're thinking about China and where it fits in their view of the world. But they've issued an interim national security strategic guidance, which is about a 15-page document that actually talks quite a bit about China and about Asia. And it does, as you mentioned, say authoritarianism is on the march, that this is a threat to the United States. And it views democracy not just as a value to be defended, but also actually as a strategic asset to be deployed, which is kind of a new way of thinking about or framing the importance of democracy in American national security policymaking. That's something. It talks about autocracy as posing an asymmetric threat and the need for democracies to adopt what they call an offset strategy. In other words, that there are certain tools that autocracies and authoritarian regimes have to take advantage of and erode the democratic advantage, and that it's the key task for the United States and like-minded democracies is to use the unique strengths that democratic political systems have to try to offset those advantages. And so, that is a whole range of things around, strengthening democracy at home, strengthening competitiveness, but also reinvigorating democracy abroad and really focusing on the alliances that are defined in terms of these shared democratic values and an interest in democracy. And again, it's pretty clear from that interim national security strategic guidance that China is a key motivator for this way of thinking about the world and this so-called kind of democratic offset strategy, which one think tank report, that's the term that was used by a think tank report that was developed by a task force, and about half of that task force is now in senior positions in the Biden administration. So I think it's actually been a pretty good guide so far to the way they've approached policy. Let me conclude by just identifying two things that I think are going to pose challenges to that way of framing American national security strategy vis-a-vis China and in Asia. And I think that we need to be realistic that every national security strategy has its downsides. Every strategy has costs. Every strategy has drawbacks. So this is not necessarily saying that they've adopted the wrong strategy, but we do need to think about where that strategy is going to run into challenges. And when I look at policy in Asia, I see two. One is that because China has adopted already a really ideological framework for thinking about state security, the emphasis on democracy and human rights is going to be really acutely concerning. And especially if they see that as in any way, whether it's intended to or not, destabilizing of party control, or even trying to put boundaries or limits on party control that the CCP might not want, then that very framework could be seen as threatening to the CCP's interests, and it heightens on the Chinese side the sense that there's a zero-sum competition going on. And I think it can make some compromise and reassurance harder. Again, I see a lot of the drivers of that as actually being in the framework that China adopted under Xi Jinping, really starting back in 2013, 2014. And I'm not sure there's much that the United States or anyone else can do to change that framework. It's just something we have to be aware of and live with as the United States implements this strategy. The final thing that I'll say is that this also poses some challenge for the United States, both in Asia as a region, in the Indo-Pacific, but also globally, because there are some pretty long-standing and important U.S. strategic alliances and strategic partners that are not democracies. And it was interesting that this interim national security strategic guidance that I'm talking about mentioned NATO. It mentioned Australia, Japan, and Korea, kind of in the context of dealing with the challenge from an authoritarian China. The two alliances it didn't mention are the ones in Southeast Asia, and that's the American alliance with the Philippines and with Thailand. Both of those alliances actually predate the alliance, the signing of the alliance agreements and the mutual defense treaties with Japan and Korea. But those countries have struggled more with their liberal democratic frameworks or are outright autocracies. And that's a problem that you see with American foreign policy in general is going to encounter. Even if you think about the Middle East, there are a lot of American longstanding allies and partners in the Middle East that are also not democracies. And so for the United States to frame its approach to the world in terms of democracy, I think is going to potentially heighten some of the tensions and contradictions in U.S. policy when it comes to countries like Saudi Arabia or Bahrain or other places. So again, this is a global issue. And one of the things that I think we'll see the Biden administration sort of trying to work out on a case-by-case basis over the coming months. But it is a really important point to remember. And I would add, I guess, even some of the countries in East Asia that are themselves democracies, such as South Korea, don't necessarily want to be forced to choose outright either the United States or China. They look to the United States for security. to China for a lot of their economic prosperity, and a choice would be very, very, difficult for them to make. And so, I think we're going to see that this attempt to really operate on the basis of shared democratic values produces some really interesting alignments, interesting progress, but also, is going to pose some key challenges. It may be an effective tool to try to get a country like India to avoid democratic erosion. But it also, again, is going to open the United States to some pressure from civil society in some of these countries, or from sort of a question about how coherent its strategy is if there's a partnership that's really critically important, but the current regime or administration in that country is really not living up to its democratic promise. And so that's, one of the, I think, the most interesting wrinkles in the implementation of this strategy, and it'll be very interesting to see where the administration takes it. I will stop there and look forward to hearing what my colleagues have to say, and discussing these ideas further with them. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheena. Now, Minxin Pei, how are we to be thinking about China after Trump?
Okay, thank you so much, Ed, and I want to thank the audience for having me here tonight. Uh, of Trump's foreign policy legacies, U.S.-China relations is the most consequential and is going to be the longest-lasting legacy. Uh, a lot of my colleagues and myself included believe that we are entering probably a full generation of very hostile, sometimes very dangerous confrontation with China. So this is a very different world compared with 2016. So this is an opening remark. Uh, and that's because the elites in both countries believe, and I'm talking political and to a lesser extent economic elites, that these two countries are in a sort of Cold War-like situation, open-ended conflict, and it will take really at least 30, 40 years for them to return to some kind of normal relationship. So because of this perception, Chinese leaders have developed a set of strategic assumptions and countermeasures. They are mobilizing for this open-ended, Cold War-like strategic competition, whatever you want to call it. So what are they thinking about this relationship? And based on their recent behavior, uh, most of us are surprised that the Chinese leaders are throwing away an opportunity to cooperate with the Biden administration, to lower the temperature, to show some goodwill, and build some kind of off ramp. And I think this kind of behavior is very closely connected with their assumptions and their strategy going forward. So, what about their strategic assumptions? Uh, there are two sets of assumptions. One set of assumption deals with their perceived strengths for China. The other is their perceived weakness. So, what are the strategic strengths China or Chinese leaders believe that they possess in their drawn out strategic competition with the US? Uh, I want to briefly mention three. In this discussion, we really have to keep in mind the history of the Cold War, because I think going forward, both countries will be informed and heavily influenced by our interpretation of the Cold War and by the history of the Cold War. So the Chinese leaders believe that they are much better positioned than the Soviet Union in dealing with the US. Uh, because of two things. One is that the Chinese economy is a much more productive economy than the Soviet economy. The Soviet command economy was really horrible in terms of its efficiency. The Chinese economy is not as productive as the US, but it is a lot more productive than the Soviet Union. Uh, Secondly, they also believe that they have stronger growth momentum Chinese economy, the growth potential is about 6% a year. Uh, the Chinese per capita income is still about a third of the US. The US is a very mature economy. There's a limit to how far the US can grow. So if the Chinese economy does not collapse, and it's not really a possibility as far as we can see, it's a mathematical certainty that they are going to surpass the US. So when you look at the Soviet Union, at its peak, the Soviet GDP was about 30 to 50% of US GDP. So if you think that the size of the economy matters, it matters in two ways. Again, this is from the Chinese perspective. One is that they can much more effectively, or they can afford to finance a drawn-out geopolitical competition in general, and an struggle, or arms race, I'm sorry, arms race in particular. I was reading Gorbachev's memoir. It's a book I actually highly recommend people to read because it has a lot of bearing on China's future. Gorbachev said that when he took over, the Soviet economy, the Soviet Union was spending 20% of its GDP on the arms race. And just because the Soviet Union was 30% to 40% of the US economy, and that is a game that's going to bankrupt the Soviet Union with a high degree of certainty. But the Chinese leaders believe that they are not going to fall into that trap, even if they need to invest a huge amount in arms race, they can stay in the game long enough. Second is that the psychological change that comes with the perception that China is the biggest dollar economy. China already is the biggest economy in power parity, and they will shift strategic calculation. So they count on the economic, and second, they also look at the Soviet Union and Cold War history, and they quickly would conclude that this time it will be very difficult for the U.S. to build a broad-based alliance against China, and that's because China is deeply embedded in the global economy. And the Soviet Union was really isolated from the global economy. So other countries will have to pay an upfront bill if they want to join the US alliance. And Australia is not being forced by China to pay the bill. So they believe that in in this globalized world, refighting the Cold War will be very difficult for the US. They also think that US-China's competition is all about raw power. So I think that's why it is quite smart for the Biden administration to reframe this conflict. Because if the US-China competition or this rivalry is framed between the two countries and also for the rest of the world as a pure raw struggle for power, then most other countries because few countries have any interest in seeing just one process prevail over other for the reason of attaining global hegemony. Uh, but if that is the case, China believes that not many countries would join the US because China is not a security threat to most countries in the world. Unlike the Soviet Union was a security threat and also an ideological threat. Except for Japan, India, Taiwan, and maybe Vietnam, China's growth in military strength does not pose a real problem. All other countries uh, really don't feel the same level. So that is, and on top of that, most countries would believe that the biggest threat to humanity is climate change, and they will have genuine trouble thinking about China as their existential threat. So these are the strategic assumptions. Whether they are correct or wrong, I think remains to be seen. Personally, I think they have some basis in reality. But the Chinese leaders also know that they are very vulnerable, a lot weaker relative to the US, despite broad trajectory. That is, first of all, militarily, uh, and in military, they are actually a lot weaker than the US. The US has a very capable fighting force, battle tested since the end of the Cold War. And if there has to be a fight, it is unlikely China will prevail. China will be very lucky to uh, sort of have a draw in this military conflict. So China's strategy is to avoid, in the short to medium term, a direct military conflict with the US. And that I think we should bear in mind because we hear a lot of talk, I would say loose talk, about China trying to use its military force to take back Taiwan. That is highly unlikely because that will be almost suicidal for China to do in the next within the next decade. The other weakness China has is really its weak technology. China may have some niche technology that is pretty good or close to the US level. But for the most part, Chinese technology cannot compare with the US. And in the last 2 years, we've seen how US technology sanctions are having an impact on China. Just take the case of Huawei. Huawei used to be number one in the world in, as a smartphone producer. Now it's dropped to number five as a result of US sanctions. And China is aware, painfully aware actually, of its technological weaknesses in this regard. So going forward, based on these strategic assumptions, China is developing, formulating, and I think putting into effect a largely domestic-based strategy. China believes that if it wants to stay in the game, it has to sustain economic growth and overcome its technological disadvantages. So in the last National People's Congress, they put together the next 5-year plan and actually 15-year plan. And it really has two focuses. One is to reorient economic growth toward from external demand to domestic demand. That is because the Chinese economy is already close to 50 trillion. They believe that if they can sustain domestic growth, they can do 5-6% for another 10 years. They will be much less vulnerable to trade wars. So this is the other is they're going to invest massively in domestic technological development. So got tech self-sufficiency because they want to achieve resilience and self-reliance in some critical areas of technology, especially computer chips, avionics, jet engines. So these are the areas where the US lead by a huge margin. So this is what they think. This is where they are headed. So what can go wrong with? I point out straight. That is, it is even though I think a strategic assumption today is that they still want to avoid a military conflict with the US. There are two sets of very dangerous dynamics that could actually make this conflict more likely than they would otherwise like to see. One is the logic of China comes into this geopolitical conflict with a significantly weaker military. So it would be quite understandable for them to ramp up sort of investments in arms and arms race. So we're going to see an arms race. And arms race itself is very dangerous. And second is Taiwan, because the foundations that keep peace and stability in Taiwan have collapsed. So the escalating tensions could bring the US and China into a conflict. So that's one. The other is that their economic strategy may not be successful because they've been talking about domestic demand, tech, tech self-sufficiency for ages, for at least 2 decades, as they've not really made that much progress. So it's doubtful that they are going to do much better this time. And third is that they should not assume blithely that American allies will stay neutral. I think Chinese conduct can actually drive them for the US camp. So they have to be very, very careful if they want to stay this open-ended game and not lose. So I guess I'll stop here and leave the floor to my other colleagues.
Thank you, Minxin. Now, Jonathan Stromseth, how should we be thinking about China after Trump?
Well, let me start by thanking you, Ed, for the invitation. I also wish this was in person, because if it was, I wouldn't be just coming back to my alma mater, but actually the town that I grew up in, and could see my parents after this event and have a glass of wine with them. But hopefully we can do that next year. I'd like to start by saying, I really appreciated how you framed your opening remarks, and I think I'll touch on a couple of those points myself, and then transition into what the Biden administration is doing or could do. First, I think the debate that we've heard a lot about in the last few years about changing China, and perhaps overly ambitious notions of that, is somewhat misplaced from my own personal experience. For instance, I lived in China for 8.5 years until 6 or 7 years ago, heading up an American NGO where we looked at environmental protection issues, women's empowerment, but we also supported Chinese legal reforms and governance reforms. And sometimes these were very significant reforms to create open government information, greater transparency, public participation. And sometimes we were able to measure reduced corruption and that kind of thing. But while it was an exciting time, I was never really under the illusion that this was going to create systemic change or that big change was around the corner. I kind of understood China's political system for what it was. Similarly, in my time with the Obama administration and the second term, it's true that we tried hard to create areas of cooperation with China to help address global threats and challenges like climate change, global health issues like Ebola. But frankly, we always started from the premise of what is the US interest, seeing if there's overlap with China in those interests. And then trying to mobilize, Chinese resources for goals, American foreign policy goals that we had already predefined. Sure, we saw the problems, and we also continued to push back where there were differences, and there were many. But I see a little more of a through line, I'd have to say, compared to some others. Then, of course, as you pointed out, we had the Trump administration, and a lot changed. We appeared, as Henry Kissinger has said, in the foothills of a new Cold War. This is particularly true in the part of the world that I tend to focus on most these days, which is Southeast Asia, which is a very dynamic region of 650 million people, 10 countries, and is sometimes seen, and I see it, as a sort of testing ground for China's rise in the world more generally, and a hotbed or epicenter of US-China rivalry and competition in the world. There, China is trying to basically realize its longstanding territorial claims in the South China Sea, as Sheena mentioned. But what I've really noticed in the last few years is that China is achieving its strategic goals in the region through what we sometimes call economic statecraft, or just economic activities and influence through the Belt and Road Initiative, new trade initiatives, for instance, and also just incredible integration economically, not just in trade, but also in supply chains. So in that context, the Trump administration really presented a choice to Asia about, and this was literally in their national security strategy and defense security strategy, about encouraging the region effectively to choose between a free or repressive vision of regional or world order. It also talked about China as practicing predatory economics, debt trap diplomacy, preaching to a region that needs about $210 billion a year in infrastructure support just to maintain their current level of economic growth. And this kind of provoked a mantra from the region that we heard, which isn't always constructive, but it was, don't make us choose. And I think in the past, they've long felt that, and they felt it equally toward China and the United States. But at least during the Trump administration, it was certainly pointed more in Washington's direction. Today now, the new Biden administration, of course, is in the White House. And, I'm very pleased, if I can say, that, we have a very sophisticated and experienced team back in charge. And, rather than alienating allies and partners, they're engaging them in a way and in an effort to try to build leverage and more effective competition with China. And the administration has specifically said, and I quote or paraphrase, that we should compete with China in some realms, cooperate with it in others, and confront the Chinese where we must. So far, I think, and I think you hinted at this in your remarks, Ed, we've seen mostly confrontation. While, as I understand it, a big China review is underway within the administration. So it's very early days, and we'll see how it turns out. I certainly agree that the U.S. should stand up to China when it violates international law, say in the South China Sea, or threatens democracy in Hong Kong. But I think it's also important, as there's all this talk of a new Cold War, that as a colleague of mine, Ryan Hawes, recently wrote in Foreign Affairs, we should remember that China is not 10 feet tall. And it's also important to right-size China in order to get a proper diagnosis of what we're competing against and get our own China policy right. And I would say, for example, look at the kind of democracy debate that you also, I think, brought up in your remarks. And, obviously, democracy is very challenged around the world. It's very challenged. There was a New York Times story just yesterday about the challenge of democracy in Southeast Asia, whether it's Thailand, the Philippines, or, of course, Burma. But I think we have to be careful not to jump too quickly to the conclusion that this is all because, China is promoting some kind of authoritarian model, whether in its own likeness or otherwise. Personally, as someone who's lived a great part of my life in Southeast Asia, frankly, I'm very, sympathetic to a view that looks at historical and domestic drivers as the key problems. And sure, there may be indirect effects. I think China is certainly trying to undermine notions of Western democracy by highlighting its flaws through their own propaganda. I think that it's also exporting surveillance technology, which I don't think is the primary driver of authoritarianism in Southeast Asia, but indirectly, it may be perhaps supporting already existing authoritarian trends or inhibiting democratic consolidation in some cases. But you can see, for example, in the tragic coup in Burma just recently, I think people were quick to think, oh, it must have been because of China. Well, in fact, China had been trying to have warming relations with Aung San Suu Kyi before she was overthrown because it saw that pathway as the best way to basically ensure its own strategic interests in Myanmar, whether it is Myanmar's active participation in the Belt and Road Initiative or its access to ports and that kind of thing. And meanwhile, the Burmese military, which has a very deep historical role in Burmese politics, had longstanding suspicions of China. Now that could change. We'll see sort of how the chips fall as China watches and sees and sees what its best play going forward. But personally, I think as the United States and the Biden administration starts to rethink some of its policies in the region, including foreign aid policy, I think it's just, if not more important, to look at these internal drivers and problems as it is focusing or overly fixating on the China threat to democracy. And then let me just close with, a couple thoughts on, specific policy recommendations. I said earlier that I think China is really achieving a lot through economic statecraft, or otherwise said, achieving foreign policy goals through economic means and mechanisms. I really believe that that's true. And for the United States to be able to compete effectively with China in Southeast Asia, again, the region that I work on the most, I really think that it needs to up its economic game in the region with allies and partners, particularly Japan, perhaps Australia, Singapore, and others, In Southeast Asia, the region that is becoming so closely bound to China these days is the Mekong subregion, or mainland Southeast Asia, which is really Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and Burma. Vietnam is quite fiercely independent. Thailand, in fact, in some ways they all are, but there's a lot of economic investment there. So I think one thing the US could do, for instance, the Trump administration made some efforts. They tried to up the economic game by creating trilateral mechanisms or agreements with Japan and Australia and others in order to improve the US footprint. But these weren't really operationalized, and few projects have resulted. And I think that the Biden administration could help to basically operationalize and accelerate some of these agreements, not to necessarily, confront BRI, or the Belt and Road Initiative in Southeast Asia, but to create alternatives and then perhaps re-engage China from a position of strength. I also think the Biden administration should try to at least begin the exploration of joining the TPP, or what's called the CPTPP. That's a heavy political lift, but it would give the US a lot of leverage vis-a-vis China in the region. And finally, I think there are opportunities to engage China on climate change. And this would send a real, I think, positive signal to Southeast Asia, which is a region that is very vulnerable as a maritime region to global warming, that some kind of cooperation is possible between the United States and China going forward. I don't think this necessarily needs to be a bilateral initiative. It could be done in an international or multilateral context. For instance, the World Bank has a lot of trust funds that might be a two-country trust fund or a multi-country trust fund. Something like that could be set up, supported. I think it'd be great if it did have the sort of US-China bumper sticker so people could see that cooperation. And then third countries who are trying to mitigate climate change or just deal with the problem, could apply for those funds to basically help meet their commitments under the Paris Agreement, for instance. Those are just some ideas I have going forward, but happy to now participate in some discussion.
Thank you, Jonathan. In some of the things that you've said and in some of Sheena's remarks, there has been a kind of nervousness or concern maybe about pushing the democracy line too hard, and I suppose one can make some connections here to human rights talk and that sort of thing. And I'm just wondering how everyone on the panel reacts to what's happened just very recently on the human rights front. The Biden State Department in March, comes out like gangbusters, imposes sanctions on Chinese officials for interfering with Hong Kong's democratic processes. But then subsequently, there was the meeting in Alaska between U.S. and China representatives where the Chinese reps objected to U.S. lecturing of China on human rights as an overstepping of national sovereignty boundaries and as hypocritical, given in this objection U.S. violation of human rights within its own borders. In this context, one of the Chinese representatives cited Black Lives Matter and American police brutality in support of his indictment of the United States on human rights. Nonetheless, the Biden administration has insisted calling China out on human rights violations would continue. What do people on the panel think about that? Let's just start with Sheena. Do you think that they came on too strong, too early on that matter, or was that something that the Biden administration says, here we stand, we can do no other? I mean, this is such an important matter, we have to take a stand here, we can't back down on it. How does that relate to the concern expressed about being pragmatic, being sensitive to the fact that some of the allies are authoritarian in their sensibilities and systems? What do you think, Sheena, about how the Biden administration came out on that fairly strong?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. It strikes me that this really is a core, values commitment on their part. And I would say that includes President Biden himself. One of the other areas I work on is North Korea, and President Biden, when he was Senator Biden, was pretty instrumental back in 2004-ish in passing the North Korea Human Rights Act. So this is a principle and a set of commitments that I think he brings to the office, and he has a team that shares that. Many of them had spent 4 years thinking about how to operationalize that in a strategic sense. It's very clear from what they've said that they also believe that there's a lot of work that needs to be done to reinvigorate American democracy at home. There's the national security strategy actually has a fair amount about American domestic politics and what's needed to build and strengthen American democracy. So my sense is that they see that as a sort of shared global project, that democratic erosion or concerns about defending and safeguarding democracy include the United States, and that as they said in Alaska, I sort of take them at their word that their response is, we know it's not perfect. That's in the strategic documents that they had issued, and that they see that as an area where there's still a lot of room to partner with other maybe imperfect or flawed democracies to still try to improve the quality of democracy and improve public services, public goods provided to citizens. I was really actually interested and heartened to see that the Quad focused on emerging technology, which is an area that I've looked a little bit at, and looked at Chinese export of surveillance technology. That's a really important area where I think we do need to come up with a democracy compatible alternative to some of the technologies that China's exported. And some of the work I've done, including a paper that was published by the Brookings Institution, I looked at the spread of Chinese surveillance technology, and one of the things we see is that cities and provincial governments in countries often adopt that technology because they're looking for a solution to urban safety problems and violent crime. It turns out the technology doesn't work very well for actually fixing violent crime problems. This is part of the follow-on project I'm doing now, and it does actually increase or facilitate repression. Now, maybe those regimes, to Jonathan's point, were democratically backsliding and becoming more repressive anyway, but the technology does appear to facilitate human rights abuses when it's adopted. So I was really heartened to see that the Quad identified emerging technology and as an area to work on. Same with vaccine provision, right? This is a global public good. It's important to the United States that the world gets vaccinated, not just that the United States does a good job, right? The whole lesson of the pandemic is that things that start, public health issues that start overseas can have a huge impact on the United States. And so it was, those two areas strike me as really important. If I have one concern, it's that at times the United States has shown up in countries in Southeast Asia or around the world and wanted to talk about China before it talks about the interests or developments in the country it's actually sitting in and having this conversation in. So, for example, in Malaysia, before the United States, the first thing out of the United States, U.S. diplomats' mouths, and we've got very talented diplomats, I'm not saying that this is always what happened, but at times some of the rhetoric from the administration was, I think, too single-mindedly focused on China, rather than looking on a country-by-country basis, saying, what are the shared interests we have in this specific country? Where is there room to work together? And China can be a part of that puzzle, but not the sole driver of the United States relationships with other countries. So in terms of the emphasis on human rights, clearly there are massive human rights challenges in China today, particularly but not limited to Xinjiang. And I think, some of the critiques also that we heard from Chinese diplomats are things that China has been saying in a quieter way, for example, in the human rights report it writes on the United States every year, for some time, right? Criticism of racial politics or inequality are pretty long-standing Chinese complaints. It's unusual to have these aired in that kind of public discussion. But I think, given the direction that relationship had gone, some of that tension is going to be unavoidable given the way that the Biden administration is approaching this, and I think those are sincere commitments. So I To me, I don't see really a way around confronting that this is an area where there really is growing tension, given the importance the administration places on that and the direction that China has chosen to take those issues.
Thank you. Here's a question we're getting from the Asian Conversation program at St. Olaf, and it relates to the human rights issue. I mean, how much does the population of China know about what is happening in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs? Minxin, do you have response?
I don't think they know that much because there's a lot of censorship about what's going on. But just based on really no scientific surveys, just based on my reading of Chinese social media and so forth, more or less Chinese people are behind the government on this. This is a very regrettable thing to say, but Chinese people, just want to talk about every Chinese people, seem to have bought their government's propaganda that there's a serious problem of terrorism in Xinjiang, and the government is doing its best to maintain stability. And the West has singled out Xinjiang, not because of problems in Xinjiang, but because Xinjiang is such a cudgel with which they can hit China. So that is the situation within China as far as Xinjiang is concerned.
Thank you. Jonathan, what's your take on Biden administration human rights issues as part of the larger diplomatic project?
Just trying to get rid of that echo. You know, I really can't add much to what Sheena said on that. I think the U.S. does need to, stand up for its own values in these situations. I think what we have is, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, kind of three balls in the air right now, and it's how to compete, cooperate, and confront all in one, and still have an effective, relationship with China in terms of managing friction and achieving some level of cooperation on global governance issues. But I do think that this is going to remain a feature of this administration. I think it's something they're committed to, and I think it's something that the Chinese are going to have to get used to. So I think I think we'll just have to kind of watch it from that perspective and see whether or not it's possible for the Biden administration, to thread the needle. John Kerry, former Secretary of State John Kerry, is now, of course, the U.S. climate envoy to the world. He is actually arriving. He's in China this week, and it's first high-level visit, and it will, we'll kind of see if he's able to sort of isolate this issue and create some progress while this other stuff is going on. And I think it's a work in progress. But I think many of the people who now have high-level positions within the administration have written in Foreign Affairs and elsewhere that we need to learn how to coexist with China, and we need ultimately to find some way to cooperate. And the question is, how will that happen? When are we going to turn to those things, and what will they be about? And I think odds are they're going to be about climate and global health issues like pandemic preparedness.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think now we'll go to a question pre-recorded on video. So let's hear that.
Hi, my name is Matthew Myers. I'm a junior math and quantitative economics major, and I'm currently taking international economics. My question is this. Western companies such as H&M and Nike are facing backlash and boycotts in China over their condemnation of the use of forced labor in the Xinjiang region of China. This has threatened their access to one of the world's largest markets. Do you think that Western companies will be able to continue to operate in China while maintaining a commitment to human rights? Why or why not? Thank you.
Sheena, you want to try that?
I'm happy to try that, although my colleagues may have a few things to add. I think this is going to be increasingly difficult for US companies. At this point, there is such a lack of clarity about the use of forced labor in Xinjiang, and there are so many suspicions of the supply chain that it's very, very difficult for a Western company to have confidence in any operations in Xinjiang or that uses products from Xinjiang. So I think as it relates specifically to Xinjiang, that's going to be an ongoing issue, and it's now expanding to other issues like the issue of solar technology was in the news earlier today. But I think the other issue that this really brings to the fore is the vulnerability that comes with operating in and developing reliance on the Chinese market, just as a matter of corporate strategy. If one wants to retain some sort of political independence or to disagree with or depart from, agreement with Chinese practices. The United States and American companies are not alone in having this challenge. There have been, economic boycotts and attempted economic coercion applied to Australia, to Norway, to the Philippines, to Taiwan, to South Korea. So the United States and U.S. companies are far from the only ones to be facing this pressure. And it's now become a sort of a feature of China's economic statecraft. So it's the sort of counterpoint, I think, to some of the issues that Jonathan was raising earlier about China's growing economic weight in Southeast Asia. That comes with this potential vulnerability to pressure if a country or a company takes a stance that is inconsistent with the preferences of the Chinese party state. And again, I think this is something that the Biden administration highlighted in some of its strategic guidance. It's not an issue that we've seen a clear sort of set of principles or strategy or plan laid out on. But I think it is an area that we're likely to see conversations with allies and partners in Europe, as well as throughout the rest of the world, because this has become a repeated issue that has really affected and is seen now as affecting not only corporate practices, but in the case of the NBA, the sort of speech of one particular individual then was used as a reason to hold the NBA's operations in China in abeyance. And so that really has the effect of chilling speech and individual freedom of speech among individuals in the United States or worldwide. So I think this is going, again, not an issue where there are easy answers. We don't have enough information about the administration's strategy yet, but I do think this is an area that we're going to see come up and be addressed at some point in the next 4 years. But I don't know if Minxin or Jonathan have something they'd want to add to that.
Minxin, you want to address this?
I think Western companies are between a rock and a hard place. That's because China is both a very big consumer market for them, but also a critical supply. So they cannot afford to just write China off. I see this is a problem for the next 10, 15 years, because unless they find alternative markets for growth and production, they're stuck with China. So that's their real problem. But they are now trying to find solution to this. So China's leverage will decrease over time. Then the other issue I think these companies probably should think about is that if they want to take a stand, they better coordinate among themselves. China can pick one company off quite easily, but if it has to deal with all of the multinationals, then China will be actually very careful. And third point I want to make is that China has to be careful, because if it keeps on bullying Western companies, then it will be actually shooting itself in the foot. It will be engaging in the process of economic decoupling for the rest of the world. So it's so we're talking about a difficult situation, and probably with some very diplomatic handling, they can find an interim solution to just keep things under control.
Thank you, Minxin. Jonathan, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I could just add that, I think it's a really good question. And I think it's actually going to become a bigger and bigger issue also as the Olympics approach, where I think it's really going to put, as Minxin said, American companies between a rock and a hard place, whether they're, standing up for some values in this case, or the bottom line and access to the Chinese market or Chinese production platforms. I think one possibility that we've been seeing already emerging is that a lot of companies have a kind of China plus one strategy, meaning they're starting to put some of their operations, if they actually have factory and production platforms in China, to other countries like Southeast Asia. Vietnam has been a great beneficiary of this. You also see Thailand and other Southeast Asian countries. But at the same time, I think China is still, basically produces about 20 to 25% of global value added. And so while shifting some operations to Southeast Asia can be a huge boost to those countries, I think there's a limit to how quickly this can happen. It's going to be slow. And I would finally just agree with Sheena very much about how China's economic relationship to other countries, which we call, economic statecraft, it has both inducements like the support for infrastructure development, and often, at least sometimes, positive two-way trade relationships. But it can also, as some of these companies are finding, have also threats. So it's sort of a combination of inducements and threats. And certainly some countries in Southeast Asia have experienced this when they stop buying bananas from the Philippines, or there's a cutoff, especially of tourists, which can really devastate economies in Southeast Asia. So they're used to playing this game, and it's one reason why most countries are both wanting to have the economic benefits that come with a strong relationship with China, but they're also wary and concerned about what some provocative behavior on their side could produce in terms of China's behavior back toward them.
Thanks, Jonathan. You mentioned the Winter Olympics, and we have another question from the Asian Conversation Program. There is some controversy related to the Winter Olympics in Beijing. Do you think countries will boycott because of internal affairs in China? Jonathan, you want to take that?
I think that most countries are going to go through with it and participate in the Olympics. I haven't been following this terribly closely, but that's my gut sense. And there'll be an effort to sort of isolate and separate official policy versus the interests and plans of the athletes themselves.
Minxin, you have any response to that?
Yeah, there was a story in Financial Times about a week ago about the U.S. State Department spokesperson talking about sort of looking into this issue. Then within 48 hours, the White House shut it down. So it's I think the likelihood of a full boycott is still low. Of course, something can happen in between now and February next year. But something like a partial boycott, that is, Western companies will be asked not to advertise, and no Western political leaders will go. That is far more likely.
Thank you, Minxin. Let's move to the next video question.
Hi, I'm Michael Paredes. I'm a junior here at St. Olaf, majoring in quantitative economics and political science, and I'm asking this question on behalf of my international economics course. In recent years, China has been developing its Belt and Road project, providing a lot of financial assistance to developing countries along its Belt and Road route. I'd like to know your perspective on the Belt and Road project and whether we should see any change in China's role in these developing nations given the new Biden administration.
Jonathan, you've been pressing economic statecraft, so what do you think of that?
Well, excuse me a second. My colleague David Dollar at Brookings, I would encourage you to look at his writing on the Belt and Road Initiative, which is expansive, both his writing and the initiative itself. He tends to focus on kind of where China is really investing their money as compared to what are the officially designated Belt and Road countries around the world. But I think when the Belt and Road Initiative first came out, there was a lot of concern, including I think in the developing world, and again I focus primarily on Southeast Asia, that it may actually result in some debts and other things in Southeast Asia. We see that particularly in Laos, maybe a little bit in Cambodia. But I think while there was a lot of concern, particularly during the Trump administration, and an effort to really kind of demonize the Belt and Road Initiative, eventually even the Trump administration realized that this wasn't playing very well as a policy. In Southeast Asia, for instance, as I mentioned, it's really only Laos and Cambodia, and primarily Laos, that are facing debt issues in terms of its debt ratio and so on. And what you saw over the last 3 or 4 years is Southeast Asian countries getting smarter in the way that they're negotiating with China. Indonesia's done that. It's basically taking great strides in trying to make sure that whatever Belt and Road Initiative projects they accept really are supporting their own domestically determined priorities for maritime infrastructure, for instance. In Malaysia, there was a celebrated case where when Mahathir came back to power, he tried, he successfully renegotiated a railway project. I think brought the project about a third down in price. And so what we're finding is that in this case, in this region, Southeast Asia is successfully getting smarter about basically how they're dealing with China, negotiating with China on BRI. And you all Chinese recognizing their implementation mistakes and kind of preempting criticism in advance. So in that region, both sides are definitely getting smarter, which in my opinion means that it's likely that we're going to see, I think, a more enduring kind of possibility for the Belt and Road Initiative, a more sustainable aspect of it. The one thing I would add to play off of one of Sheena's comments, where she was talking about the Quad, or what's called the quadrilateral security dialogue, which is really coming up fast toward the end, or kind of making a comeback toward the end of the Trump administration, and now especially during the Biden administration. And the Biden administration has tried to expand this group, which includes the US, Japan, Australia, and India, beyond just security issues. And it also includes, as Sheena mentioned, work on technology, a vaccine working group, and also a climate working group. And as much as some, other regional bodies like the Association of Southeast Asian Nations in Southeast Asia might be a little suspicious of the Quad because it's kind of stealing its thunder, they're at least encouraged about a greater focus on economic issues. And I would hope that, they might even think about creating an infrastructure working group where some of those platforms I mentioned, agreements between Japan, say Australia, the US, agreements between the US and Singapore, et cetera, could be operationalized and accelerated so that there's more alternatives for infrastructure in the region, which involves the United States. And it's not just all about BRI.
Thank you, Jonathan. Next video question.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for joining us. My name is Nathan Pellant. I'm a senior here at St. Olaf College, and I'll be asking this question on behalf of my international economics course. Over the summer, a hot topic was TikTok and how the U.S. was considering potentially banning it in the U.S. just because over data privacy issues and possible connections to the Chinese government. I guess a follow-up question off of that would be if the US ever did go to the lengths of banning a Chinese company from operating within the United States, do you think that China would retaliate in a sense and consider banning a US company from operating in China? Or how do you think that would shake out? Thanks.
Minxin, you want to take that?
Okay. TikTok issue is really interesting. That's because the Trump administration's policy so far has suffered legal setbacks. There's a legal injunction against the administration in banning TikTok, and we will see how the Biden administration will handle this issue. Actually, China watchers are looking at the Biden administration's decision very carefully because it can mark a significant change from the previous administration. In substantive terms, the justifications the Trump administration gave for banning TikTok are not that strong because all the data problems, the technical problems can be addressed. This really, and interestingly, China actually doesn't care that much about TikTok being banned in the US because TikTok is not this vital technology company that has a lot of direct usefulness for China. And in response to your question whether China will retaliate, the sad truth is that China has already retaliated before the US did anything. US tech companies cannot operate in China. Google, for example, similar some tech companies that can collect a lot of data. They really cannot operate. And the infamous Great Firewall of China bans American technology or internet companies from getting to the China market. So so I think one thing you can say about banning TikTok is that, well, if you want to follow the rule of reciprocity, then it is a justified action. But if you want to cite some not really well-founded national security concerns, then you actually will be skating on very thin legal ice.
Thank you, Minxin. Here's a question from John Grotting, class of 1971, from San Diego, California. It appears that China faces challenges of an aging population and residual impact of one-child policy along with gender bias for male children. What impact will this have on China's future challenges? Sheena, do you want to try that?
Sure, happy to. Yeah, this is a challenge that that has gotten a lot of attention, including from the Chinese leadership for an extended period of time. There was just a recent piece in Foreign Affairs about China's demographic problem. One way it's sometimes referred to is a 4-2-1 family structure, where you have 4 grandparents, 2 parents who may at this point be nearing retirement age, and 1 child responsible for supporting those adults in a place where China's welfare system is sort of uneven across urban and rural areas, and not necessarily a sort of advanced progressive welfare state in all parts of China. So I think this is something that the leadership has put a lot of attention to. That's why we've seen efforts to relax the one-child policy across much of China. China switched about 3 or 4 years ago to what was in essence a 2-child policy. So it wasn't, hey, have as many children as you would like to have, but it was a shift to a 2-child policy, and there's been discussion about relaxing that further. Some of the issue is that that sort of formal relaxation hasn't actually produced the increase in birth rate that maybe the authorities were expecting, which is why I think we'll continue to see this as an area of discussion going forward.
Thank you, Sheena. Next video question.
Hello, my name is Jomit Singh, and I'm a junior from the class of 2022. And I would like to ask this question on behalf of my international economics class. Although there are no current plans for the Biden administration to remove tariffs that are in place right now, if these tariffs are removed in the future, how do you feel like this might impact US companies and specifically stakeholders in the manufacturing industries? And how do you feel these changes should be communicated to minimize the damages to these stakeholders? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not sure whom to pick on for this one. Anybody inclined of the three to Minxin? Go ahead.
Yeah, I've thought about this issue quite a bit. I think the damage for the terror by imposing tariffs is already done. That is, companies have now built into their long-term strategic planning that China is not a safe, secure place to put their plants there. So the relocation of supply chain will continue. The pace may slow. So that is the reality. Companies understand this. The Biden administration probably understands this too, if I know this. And the Chinese certainly understand this. The real issue is not about tariffs. It's about whether other alternative production sites can become as competitive, as efficient as China. It will take about 10, 15 years. So in interim, tariffs uh, will impact how American consumers behave, but it will not really impact a lot about whether supply chains will move as fast.
Thank you. Here's a question from Sam Bailey, class of 2021 from St. Olaf campus. Back in July of 2020, the U.S. closed a Chinese consulate in Texas on short notice due to its alleged use in espionage operations. In response, the Chinese government closed the U.S. consulate. What prevented this series of diplomatic actions from escalating and further degrading bilateral relations? Why did each government stop at just one consulate? Sheena, you want to take a shot at this? I'm not.
This tonight, I'm happy to take that. First, I think it's important to recognize that that's a pretty severe, partial rupture in the bilateral relationship already. To go ahead and close a consulate in each place. I think, on the U.S. side, this gets to a lot of the concerns, particularly that the Trump administration had, and a problem that they really focused on much more, I would say, intensively and systematically than previous administrations, but which has also gotten a lot of attention in Congress as well. And that is the risk of illicit tech transfer, whether it's espionage or a talent program, essentially siphoning intellectual property and competitive technology, cutting edge technology, from the United States to the People's Republic of China. So, this was part of a set of policies like things like the Department of Justice's China Initiative, which looked specifically at these cases of illicit tech transfer. And again, this is something that was of interest to a lot of folks in the Senate and in Congress as well. For example, I remember this is the question of China's engagement in subnational diplomacy in the United States and Chinese, what the Senator Marco Rubio called Chinese influence operations on American campuses, was, I believe, one of his first questions to the now Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines. So this is an issue where I do think there's concern that persists beyond beyond just the Trump administration. We know that the Biden administration is reviewing, essentially all of the Trump administration's policies, including some of its treatment of Confucius Institutes and the DOJ's China initiative. My guess is that we may see some difference in messaging and attempt to partner more effectively with academic institutions. But as somebody who sits in higher ed, I think this is actually emblematic of a whole set of decisions that U.S. higher education is going to have to make. And in some ways, the pandemic forced some of these decisions more abruptly, whereas they might have otherwise been gradual. But, a lot of U.S. colleges and universities had become financially dependent on revenue from Chinese students. The pandemic obviously has kind of thrown a wrench in a lot of that. And it's not clear exactly to me how much of that student inflow will resume in the aftermath of the pandemic. In particular, given how much Chinese media has highlighted concerns about anti-Asian racism and just general safety issues in the United States. So I think that this was a pretty big step already. It's not. I don't have any inside information as to whether there's been a conversation about what it would take to undo that step on either side. Because the United States also lost the consulate in Chengdu, which provided visibility on a lot of parts of West Central and Western China that I think was helpful to the United States. So, I think this is a really important but unresolved question, and it's not quite clear to me where the Biden administration is going to come down. It's an area where I'd expect some difference, but also that we're not going to go back to the status quo ante. We're not going to go back to just sort of, saying, go do your thing, universities. I think that there's enough sort of broad-based concern about tech transfer, about illicit or a non-traditional collection at American universities, particularly in STEM fields, that we probably some of that systematic rethinking of China's role and how China's engagement in higher ed takes place. I think those conversations and that redesign is going to continue.
Thank you, Sheena. I think we have time for one more question. So the next video question, please.
Hi, my name is Pauline Costa. I'm a junior quantitative economics major, and I'm asking a question on behalf of my international economics class. My question is regarding the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP in short. Trump decided to withdraw the US from TPP in 2016, which would have been worth 40% of global trade and could have put the US in a position to counter China's use of economic tools for geopolitical reasons. Considering that China recently signed the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, do you think that the Biden administration is under pressure to rejoin the Trans-Pacific Partnership or sign a similar agreement? Are there any circumstances in which the Biden administration would rejoin the TPP or sign a similar agreement? Thank you.
Okay. I think in the first Biden administration, that is in the next 3 years, we're unlikely to see this this administration to go back to the TPP because it will become the election issue for 2024. Too much political risk. But I'm sure the administration will be exploring possibilities to return. So if it's going to happen, it will happen in the second Biden administration. If Trump comes back, or if a Republican gets elected, then we can, it will be interesting. Trump would not get the US back into TPP, but another Republican might, because it will significantly strengthen American presence and economic engagement in that part of the world.
Thank you, Minxin. Sorry about the technical difficulties, Jonathan. We have come now to the end of our time. It hardly seems possible. Things seem like we're just getting started. Thanks to the audience for joining us tonight in this stimulating exchange with China experts Sheena Greitens, Minxin Pei, and Jonathan Stromseth. And thank you so much, Sheena, Minxin, and Jonathan, for being with us and for sharing with us your views on China after Trump.
Thank you.
This spring term, St. Olaf College's Institute for Freedom and Community continues its series of public events on the theme America After Trump. The next event in this series is on freedom, populism, and big tech with Professor of Economics at George Mason University and New York Times bestselling author Brian Kaplan. That event will be on April 29th. This spring, the Institute also continues its series of public events on the theme Diversity, Freedom, and Community. The next event in that series is on freedom, open inquiry, and the Academy, with two prominent critics of the Academy, Helen Pluckrose and Alana Redstone, who claim that there is a lack of intellectual or viewpoint diversity in the Academy today. That event will be on May 11th. Learn more about these and other events at institute.stolaf.edu. That's institute.stolaf.edu. We hope you can join us for these events, but for now, good night, be safe, and be well.